Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher King, for those of you who don't know yet, and welcome to my older adult training presentation. I'd just like to say thank you for watching in advance, and let's just jump right in. So I find it exhilarating or engaging to start with the statistic pertaining to the subject that you're about to report on. So the statistic that I chose was the fact that up to 50% of those individuals aged over 60 are at risk of social isolation, and approximately 1/3 of older people will experience some degree of loneliness as well later in life. Um, while it's not necessarily a ubiquitous phenomenon, I think it's clear to see that social isolation impacts an exceptionally large portion of the older adult community. I think it's also telling that social isolation, particularly amongst older adults, is noted as one of the 12 grand challenges of social work per that website, per the Grand Challenges of Social Work website. Given such a large impact, I argue that social isolation is an issue any practitioner who has career goals of working within this community or population should work to understand how to mitigate, if not strive to eliminate, although that may be an impossible goal, especially given recent events and then their correlated insights into what our social future will look like. So, bottom line, clearly, if we're thinking along the lines of working to combat social isolation, as clinicians and practitioners, a pertinent first step would be associated with trying to define what social isolation is. And you may have seen it in the slide I accidentally went forward. But in essence, we want to work to operationalize the phenomenon and its potential impacts before we review interventions designed to mitigate said impacts. So, to get to that slide, right off the bat, I'd like to pose a question because colloquially we tend to use these terms interchangeably. And so my question, or first question rather, to you would be, what do you suppose the difference between aloneness and loneliness is? And to sort of get into the answers to that question, what I found in my research is associated with just that answer. In the process of completing research regarding how healthcare practitioners can effectively work to mitigate the impacts of social isolation, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine constructed the table that you see at the top of the slide here. And this table acts as a resource in line with understanding how these ideas connect and differ. So as you can see, the term social connection, which is the gray box at the top, encompasses three main components connected to the overall structure of relationships we create and maintain with others. That is the structural components. And then what we get out of and how we perceive these relationships, that is the functional components. And then quality, which is the quality component. Quality is basically the positive and or negative aspects of these relationships. So within this sort of metric system that they've created, the academies define social isolation or aloneness, to really connect it to the question that I posed in the previous slide, as a structural component. As you see, it's at the very bottom of social connection. What this means is it's something that can be objectively measured and assessed from an outside structural perspective. Whereas loneliness is defined as a functional component. You can see perceived loneliness in the blue functional box. It's a functional component under the umbrella of social connection. What this means, or what I took this to mean, is the fact that it's derived via the mechanism of perception. And so this makes this component subjective. And I think sort of extrapolating meaning from what this chart tells us is it can work to explain why we're sometimes physically isolated, but not necessarily feeling lonely. It can sort of illuminate the fact that they are two independent variables, which often have sort of overlapping causes and overlapping effects, but it's important to remember and note that they are two independent variables, and so they have independent impacts on health, and they should be regarded separately. So that's what I found to be the answer to what's the difference between being alone and being lonely. One is something that is objective. You either do or you don't maintain and have relationships with other human beings. And then one is more subjective. You can feel lonely in any given place, whether or not it's amongst a group of people or by yourself. And when you're by yourself, vice versa, you don't necessarily always feel lonely. So that makes it a little bit more subjective. So moving into health impacts associated with social isolation, What I'm going to do is start small on a more individual micro level, if you will, and then we'll sort of broaden our scope and look at some of the potential impacts that social isolation can have on our healthcare system on a macro level, so to speak. So to begin, social isolation has been found to be a risk factor for not only all-cause morbidity, but all-cause mortality. Morbidity being basically any list of conditions or diseases in a given population, and then mortality being any given reason why individuals pass away or die within a given population. All-cause morbidity and mortality is just a combination of the two, meaning all given diseases or conditions and or reasons why people happen to die or pass away within any given population. So the fact that social isolation is a risk factor for these things basically means that it can work to contribute to and or compound any given disease or disorder or any given reason why somebody may be at an increased risk to actually die. And it was actually found that its negative impact on outcomes was comparable to other risk factors that we take pretty seriously, such as smoking, lack of exercise, obesity, and high blood pressure. As I said, we take all of these things very seriously because research has come out and has helped us to understand the impact that these things can have on our lives if we don't pay attention along our lives. And the outcomes associated with health are usually negative, or at least they can work to make things worse. So social isolation should command the same respect as these other risk factors because the impact or the negative impact that it could have on our health are just as large. Additionally, it can serve to decrease resistance to infection. It can serve to decrease resistance to cognitive decline, as well as certain cognitive decline associated usually with aging populations such as dementias, including Alzheimer's disease. It can serve to decrease our resistance to developing depression. It can disrupt our sleep patterns. It can also increase our cortisol release, but also our cortisol sustain levels. And we know by now that sustained elevated cortisol levels in the body can serve to worsen conditions. It can lead to weight gain, depression. It can even worsen cardiovascular conditions. On the opposite end of the spectrum, on a more positive note, we find that people who are generally more socially connected can sort of receive the benefits of being socially connected when compared to those who are socially isolated. So social connections can work to buffer cardiovascular reactivity to stress, meaning that given the ups and downs of stress, somebody who is more socially connected may have less of a reaction cardiovascularly speaking to said stress, whereas in somebody who is isolated would experience the traditional increase in blood pressure, tachycardia, etc. Social connections act as a buffer against those things and can serve to act as a buffer against the negative effects of cardiovascular disease itself. Along those lines, relationships which are perceived as rewarding are also thought to be a key factor in psychological health, including happiness as well as subjective well-being. So sort of broadening our scope on a more macro level, so to speak, we see health impacts associated with healthcare costs specifically. So social isolation has been found to have a connection with three main things that serve to increase healthcare costs when taking a look at social isolation and its impact on the healthcare industry. And those things are increased emergency admission to a hospital, so more people checking into the hospital via the emergency room, a longer length of stay at hospitals, which is self-explanatory, and then an increased incidence of hospital discharge delay where they thought you would be released on a particular day, but there are certain complications with whatever you checked in for, and your discharge now has to be delayed. And all of this adds up. So per research completed by the AARP Public Policy Institute, when compared to the additional expenditure of older individuals with other chronic health conditions like arthritis, high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes, socially isolated individuals incurred an average additional monthly cost of $134, and that may not seem that much in a month's time, but if you add that up over the year, annually speaking, that amounts to almost $2,000 or $1,608. Additionally, when compared to older individuals who were more socially connected, socially isolated individuals had a higher mortality rate in a study where they completed both 3 and 6 year intervals after the baseline health interviews. So those who were less socially connected had a higher mortality rate at both intervals where they checked in with them over a period of 3 and then 6 years. So we see that social isolation can really serve to add up to increase healthcare costs, and it can objectively increase mortality rate in individuals. And this goes pretty far. Per that same AARP Public Policy Institute report, this is a direct quote, and it states that we found that a lack of social contacts among older adults is associated with an estimated 6.7 billion in additional Medicare spending annually. And that is from the phenomenon of social isolation alone. That is not anything else contributing to that dollar total. I found that to be pretty shocking as far as how it increases our healthcare costs. And so it sort of works against one of the three-pronged approaches of Obamacare, which is to reduce costs in healthcare. So if we want to work to reduce costs associated with healthcare, specifically for older adults, one of the things that we should be looking at is social isolation and working to combat that issue. Now I'd like to talk about how social isolation connects to core values, or the core values of social work, and by extension, the ethical principles within social work themselves. I connected them most via the core values, and so I call it core value connections. And if you look at what I've written here, you'll notice that 4 out of 6 core values are noted, and then missing are both integrity as well as competence. And I just want to preference my review of what I've written here by saying that I'm not saying that competence or integrity don't come into play when seeking to intervene based on social isolation as a presenting problem. However, for me, these following 4 core values really resonated the most with why we should work on social isolation as social workers. So first up is the core value of service. And basically, the core value of service is associated with a social worker working to serve others, to help others, and to combat social issues. And so in the beginning of this presentation, I noted that it's telling that social isolation, specifically amongst older adults, is noted as one of the 12 grand challenges of social work. So I think it's safe to say that social isolation is a major social issue to the extent that they thought to include it in one of the 12 grand challenges. So in working to combat this, specifically amongst the older adult population, I believe that a social worker is working within the value of service, or within the core value of service, that is. For social justice, social workers challenge social injustice. And what I say to this is we're pursuing social change on behalf of what is often considered a vulnerable population, that is the older adult community, by working to ensure they have appropriate access to not only robust social support, but other things that are ancillary to that, which are resources themselves. And so I think in working to combat this issue, social workers are working within that vein of social justice, and we're working to combat social injustice, specifically for a vulnerable population that is often exploited and or abused. As far as dignity and worth of a self-person are concerned, that's associated with social workers respecting the inherent dignity and worth of a person. And so the reason that resonates with this value for me is we can seek to intervene and or connect the individuals we work with to social supports which are appropriate for them as expressed by them. And that's not to say that we can't gently cajole an individual into increasing social engagement, because you'll often run into individuals that just don't want any form of social engagement. And respecting their dignity and self-worth and right to self-determination is not necessarily saying that you can't gently sort of get them to see why increased social engagement would be important. But it does challenge the practitioner to find ways to tailor any specific intervention to meet the biopsychosocial spiritual needs of that specific individual. So in that way, we're working to respect the dignity and worth of any given individual. And then last but not least, the importance of human relationships, which is all about social workers recognizing the central importance of human relationships. And the way that this sort of resonates with that value, this issue resonates with that value for me is because I was cut off just a bit, but I was on the last sort of topic along the core value connections with social work and ethical principles, and it was the importance of human relations. That is associated with social workers recognizing the central importance of human relationships. And I found that it resonated with this core value, or rather social isolation resonated for me with this core value, because a social worker inherently recognizes the importance of human relationships. And with that understanding and recognition, we can utilize interventions aimed at promoting and maintaining positive, appropriate social relationships to work to enhance the quality of life experienced by our older adult clients. And so those are the ways that I feel that the ethical principles or the core values of social work sort of connect to this particular issue or challenge. So at this point, I guess any given clinician would be asking, how can I tell if a client is socially isolated? And there are ways, and the two ways that I found that I just wanted to bring to the class's attention include the Lubin Social Network Scale 6, version 6 that is, and then the Revised Social Support Questionnaire, version 17. So the Lubin's Social Network Scale measures social connectivity, and so it measures I guess to connect it back to that question in aloneness and loneliness, it measures aloneness. It measures objectively how you are connected by way of measuring frequency, size, and closeness of the contacts of the client's social network, and then it assesses the perceived level of support they get from friends and family. So there is a scale going from 0 to 5 in which you are asking questions associated with that scale, including how many friends or relatives do you see or hear from at least once a month? How many friends or relatives do you feel at ease with that you can talk about private matters? How many friends or relatives do you feel close to such that you could call them for help? And so you ask these questions 2 separate times pertaining to relatives and then friends, and then the participant is to give you a score from 0 to 5, and then you total the scores, and from 0 to 30, higher scores indicate that the person has a larger social network or is a little bit more connected or is a little bit less alone, I guess you could say. Whereas the Revised Social Support Questionnaire measures feelings of loneliness, because it's a 6-item sort of assessment measure of social support, wherein respondents indicate the number of people they feel they have available to provide support in 6 areas. And so you go down all of these 6 questions, they identify a person that is associated with that question. So for instance, question number 1, who can you count on when you need help? And if you say, my son, I can count on my son when I need help, the follow-up question associated with that question number 1 would be, how satisfied are you specifically with the support that you're given in that area with your son? And so in that way, it's a way of measuring subjective feelings of loneliness in the client. So these are 2 scales that can measure not only aloneness or your social connectedness, but also loneliness, which is the subjective feeling that you have regardless of social connection. Additionally, as a third resource, the AARP has an assessment known as the How Connected Are You assessment. And if the client is either tech savvy or has friends or family that can help them with an internet assessment, or if you can help a client with the internet assessment, it would be a good resource, because you go through and you take the assessment online, it asks you the questions and you answer them. And at the end, not only does it give you an indication of how connected you are in regards to an entire spectrum of connectedness and compared to others, it also gives you resources specific to your local area that you can reach out to if you feel like you want help with social isolation specifically. So that's also a good resource. As far as interventions are concerned, this is where sort of the work sort of begins. So you've defined aloneness versus loneliness. You've worked to measure them. You know the impacts on an individual level as well as a micro level. Now what can we do to combat this issue? So obviously the go-to would be group work. And it's not necessarily always the go-to, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But group work is what I found as far as a preponderance of research pertaining to combating social isolation. The one that stood out to me the most was in a study completed by Frank, Molyneux, and Parkinson in 2017, where they compared different forms of group therapy, including gender-based social groups, Nintendo Wii gatherings, indoor gardening programs, and the form that they found the most successful, and additionally, the only one that had participant-reported significant effects on both feelings of isolation as well as depression, was something known as reminiscence group therapy. And that's basically where you have regular group therapy, and it's open process to an extent that they can talk about what they want as long as it revolves around something that happened in their lives. And in that way, they can sort of find things that they have in common. They can work to support each other in the same way that any group is facilitated, but it's all revolving around past experiences in an older adult's life. And the study further reported that the most benefit seemed to be derived from programs that, one, involve well-trained staff facilitating group-based social activity, or support where social interaction was maximized through sharing stories and fostering a shared common ground on which to base interaction. Like I said, this was the only one to have a report of participant feelings of significant effects on both isolation and depression when compared to those other groups that they sort of took a look at. Outside of that, there are additional community-based group-style interventions that are often initiated by local aging services resources. And I know they have different names in different states, such as in New Jersey, we have the Division of Aging Services. But to sort of help there, the Department of Health and Human Resources offers a directory which you can just pull up online, and it's organized by the state in which you live. And so they have sort of programs and initiatives that offer recurring group activities, which include local travel groups, nutrition programs where people can come from the community, or older adults can come from the community, and not only ensure that they're receiving the proper nutrition, but also use it as a chance to socialize with people that live in the local area. And then a whole other host of activities that they sort of offer that are offered through those local aging resources departments that go by different names in different states. What a social worker can do is sort of provide psychoeducation on a one-on-one basis with the client, and then work to connect them to these resources that are in their local area. That way, that if they find a friend or if they find social connections within these groups, you have a higher likelihood that they can get together on a recurring basis, and you have a sustained, engaging social connection for your client. I think it's important to note that the most appropriate intervention for social isolation may not always be group-based activity, even though that is the first thing that you think about when trying to combat social isolation. But I want to say that depending on the underlying reasons as to why the individual is socially isolated, you may want to work on an individual level, if not at first, and then get them connected to group or community-based resources, just because you never know what the underlying condition is that has caused the social isolation. And that condition can include things like social anxiety, depression, past trauma and abuse, all of which can significantly impact an individual's overall quality of life in their own ways, with social isolation acting as a compounding factor. So social isolation may not be the front and foremost presenting problem that you're even presented with just because you have a client from this age group, and other things may need to be worked on before you work to combat social isolation. But I think that all of that goes without saying. When you are working one-on-one with a client, there is much more of a challenge in drawing from theory to sort of serve and educate and inform your work with that client. And so a theory that comes to mind when it comes to aging, or that takes into account psychosocial changes through age, is obviously Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And when I think of the older adult population, I think of stage 8, which is the final developmental stage, and it's reserved for individuals who are age 65 and above. And so each psychosocial stage in Erikson's theory of development has a particular crisis that you have to overcome. And so with stage 8, the crisis that you have to overcome is ego integrity versus despair. Ego integrity is basically, have you lived a life that matches up and lives up to the expectations that you've had for yourself, or as the person that you inside see yourself as, or that others see you as? Or have you lived a life that's incongruent or not in line with that image that you saw of yourself? And that sort of has the two different outcomes of integrating your ego into the life that you lived, or despair because you feel like it didn't match up to the image that you have had of yourself. And this can lead to a host of things like dissatisfaction, decrease in quality of life or the perception of quality of life, depression, etc. And so given this challenge, an individual within this population may be primed for reflection. And this serves to explain specifically the power that I've witnessed in working in my second year field placement in a hospice environment, and the fact that just being present and holding space to witness what someone wants to tell you as sort of a one-on-one reminiscence therapy can be extremely powerful, because it gives them the chance to reflect. And in this psychosocial stage, we're sort of primed to reflect on all the experiences that we have. That's why my go-to whenever I'm trying to build rapport with an older adult client is to sort of ask about their past experiences, be it travels, children, their favorite things, how they've changed over their life, etc. And we term that reminiscence, and then when you get really deep, it's called life review, where you just go from beginning to end. And that can be very powerful because, like I said, individuals within this population tend to be primed to sort of reflect on everything that they go through, and that is corroborated by Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. And so that's just one jumping off point as far as theory is concerned, and that's sort of the way that it can be connected to the work that we do or the intervention that we choose in reminiscing and reflecting with an individual in any given environment where you would work with an older adult individual. So with that being said, here is my reference list for the presentation. I appreciate you sitting through my ramblings as usual. I appreciate you watching, and as I always say, good luck with this and the rest of your classes. Thank you.